Good morning. Welcome. Very happy that you're here today. Very happy to be worshiping with you online as well. You know, sometimes it is those simplest reminders that can be the most powerful ones, like the ones we just sang in that song. God is so good. He answers prayers. He cares for me. I think we have one of those reminders in the passage we're going to be looking at today. And I'd invite you to go ahead and be turning there. It's in Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah 29 is where we're going to be spending our time this morning. There we find a really powerful promise. I have seen it scribbled at the bottom of a letter to a high school graduate. I've heard it prayed over a family gathered in a small room before they take their seats for a funeral. I've seen a young couple holding hands, exchanging rings, exchanging vows, stop and listen carefully to these words recited. I read a poem that a father wrote to his daughter on the day that she was born. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Now, those words constitute a promise. And a beloved one at that. I'm sure beloved by so many of you. Like, how many of us have these words somewhere on a wall in our house, like somewhere displayed? How many cards have sailed through the mail, like bearing this promise to someone you love, to a family member, to a friend? For I know the plans that I have for you. That's a promise we should like to hear. Like hear and hear again. And perhaps now as much as ever, this is a promise that belongs in our hearts. It belongs up on our walls. The very prospects of a God with plans. Plans of hope. God with plans. Plans for a future. That should mean something to us, right? What does that mean to us? What does that mean to you? That's really what I want to talk about today. Because these words have just been on my mind a lot here lately. And so today, I want to ask you, how should we hear these words? This promise that many of us know very well and love, like especially in this time when we might really need to hear it, like how should we hear this promise of God? How should we hear it? And you know, the way that I've been thinking about this week is like this. Like if you could actually hear, like really hear, the voice of the God who speaks these words, what would that voice sound like? Of course, I know that's beyond us to imagine. Try and imagine with me. If you could hear God's voice saying these words, what would that voice sound like? What would be the tone? What would be the tenor? For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. What does that voice sound like? Would it sound a little like the voice of young George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life? How he looks into the eyes of this person who's one day going to be his wife. And do you remember just that like unbridled enthusiasm that he has, this just glimmer in his eye, this eager desire to dream up this life so intensely that it might actually happen. Remember how he says, what do you want? Do you want the moon? Remember that? I'll lasso it and pull it down for you. I'll give you a life. I've got plans for you, and you are in it. Is it that kind of voice? Is it that kind of promise? For I know the plans that I have for you. Kind of promise that makes you dare to dream. Or is it kind of like Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore in the movie We Were Soldiers? He was addressing his army before they were shipped off into a difficult battle, and he makes a promise in a very different tone. We are moving into the valley of the shadow of death, he says. We are about to face a tough and determined opponent. But this I promise you. I will be the first to step foot on the battlefield. I will be the last to step off of it. And I will leave no one behind. Dead or alive, we will all come home together. Maybe that's what this promise is like. For I know the plans that I have for you. Is it a voice that casts a spotlight on this tough, tough world and yet says anyway, I'm still with you from first to last until we come home? For I know the plans that I have for you. What kind of voice do you hear? Because for me, as I've dwelled on this passage throughout this week, the thing that I'm discovering is that this passage, in my mind, manages to speak in both of those voices. Like with both of those kinds of tones, you can hear in it George Bailey's unbridled optimism. You can hear in it Lieutenant Moore's sobering steadfastness. And both of those things can be there all at once. And maybe that's what makes this verse and God's promises so powerful and so very relevant to us, because they speak in both voices. And I'd like to spend a little time thinking about that today. If you haven't already, we're going to be in Jeremiah 29. And I want to say two things about the voices with which this promise speaks to us. First, I think we can see that this promise speaks to us in a voice that knows our struggles. And it gives us the truth that we need. And really, there is great comfort in that. But we need to know what kind of comfort it is, because it's not the kind of comfort that is cheap or easy. It's not the kind of promise that, promises butterflies and rainbows when in fact life is not that way. And it's not the kind of comfort that promises that everything's just going to be better tomorrow, just right over the hill, when in fact the battle might actually be ongoing. The struggle might actually be long. Now, I think the comfort here is more like the comfort that Army general gives in his promise. That even when things are the darkest, and even when the struggle lingers, even then, I know the plans I have for you. After all, let's just look at what's going on in Jeremiah 29 when Jeremiah delivers this promise of God. This promise of God, verse 1, comes to God's people from Jeremiah in the form of a letter. Verse 1 says, this is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent. Sent to whom? He sent it from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people that Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Okay, so here we have the setting for this promise. It comes in the form of a letter. And that's probably a form we're used to seeing these words, because how many cards have we sent to people's mailboxes with these words? But unfortunately for Israel, this is not one of those like happy graduation Hallmark kinds of moments for them. For them, they're living in exile. They're in a situation they don't want to be in. They've been forced into it. They're away from their homes, and now they must deal with the fact that they're not where they want to be. And Jeremiah sends a word from God to his people who are in this tough situation. But he doesn't tell them exactly what they might want to hear. Think about, what do you think they might want to hear when the prophet of God delivers a message to them in their state in exile? What are they hoping to hear? What would be good news for them? Can you imagine how happy they would be if this letter comes from Jeremiah and it says, well, your problems are going to be over tomorrow, just over this next hill. Business as usual will be back again. Before you know it, you'll be back home. That would have been a welcome message, right? And in fact, there are actually some others who are spreading that kind of message. One chapter earlier, there's this prophet named Hananiah. And he's making that kind of promise. He's going around to the people who have been taken into exile. He's saying, this is what the Lord says. I will break the yoke of the king of Babylon within 2 years, he says. God's going to bring back all the things that were taken from us. He'll bring back our king and all the other exiles who went to Babylon. And that sounds pretty good. That sure sounds good. It gives an easy comfort. But the trouble is, it's a hollow one. Like you can imagine if that lieutenant colonel stood before his army as they were shipping out, and what he said was, we're going to battle, but it's no big deal. We're going to win, they're going to lose, we'll be home before you know it. What would his crew think of that? Well, maybe they might hear what they want to hear for a little while, but I think a lot of them would probably prefer something else, something true and steadfast, even if the message was hard. And that's what Jeremiah gives. His message is not that easy, hollow hope, 2 years and we'll be back. What Jeremiah says in his letter, verse 5, is go ahead and build a house. Go ahead and plant your fields. Go ahead and establish your families in Babylon. I'm just giving it to you straight. This exile is going to last for 70 years. That's what he tells them. Not 2 years, 70 years. That's his message. And yet, even though that message isn't easy, and even though that burden is not light, and even though at times during that long time it may feel to God's people like God has forgotten them completely, Jeremiah says, know this also. When those 70 years are completed and that time is up, the Lord says, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all of your heart. I will be found by you declares the Lord. I will bring you back from captivity. And you can hear how that promise is different, right? God's promise here is not just that easy, hollow, sounds good kind of thing. It's actually something so much better. It's truth that is real, yet God is steadfast. It's more than just empty talk. Here's something that's going to endure even when the struggles last for longer than we may have expected. It's something that is going to endure even when the struggle is long. And that's when God's promises really start to shine, right? That's when they prove to be the treasure that they are, like when they're tested, and yet they endure. And even if we go into the valley of the shadow of death, even if we face a tough and determined opponent, God says God's going to be with us. And he's not going to forget his promises. God speaks to us in a voice like one who knows the struggles we face, doesn't whitewash them or act like they're not there, because what would be the point in that? He gives us the truth that we need. But that truth is that he is still with us, no matter what. And that's a blessing, right? It's hard, but it's a blessing. But then there's this other side of things too. Another tone that we might hear in these same words, in the voice of this same God who speaks to us. I know the plans I have for you. There's a softer side to this, a lighter side. There's a part of this promise that doesn't just speak truth into our struggles, but actually speaks hope that transcends our struggles. Hope that is not tied down to one single moment where it's difficult, which is why this promise continues to speak to us thousands of years after that exile is over. Those years came and passed. The hope that these words bring lasts forever. It brings a glimmer to our eyes and brightness to our outlook. And I hear that voice, that tone, when I remember who speaks these words. Not just anyone. Even better than a great general who, at the end of the day, can only offer their best. But this is not just anyone. This is the Lord. And not only is the Lord the God of heaven, but as Jeremiah reminds us, the Lord is one who loves us with that pure and everlasting love. Chapter 31, God says, I have loved you with an everlasting love. I have drawn you with unfailing kindness, everlasting, unfailing. I will build you up again. Like, this is the voice that's making this promise to us. It's the voice of one who loves us eternally. That's who has plans for us. It's the voice of one with shining eyes who wants to give us hope that endures. This is the voice of the one who appoints the sun to shine by day. If anyone actually could lasso the moon, this is the one. For this is the Lord that set it in its place. And even the things that seem so impossible, even the things that are beyond our comprehension, are not impossible to our God. For example, he looked at Israel in exile, and what he saw in them was an incurable wound. Your wound is incurable. That sounds final. Your injury beyond healing. That's what God says. Because of your great guilt and many sins. And then he says, of that incurable wound, I will heal it. And to the one who is beyond healing, because of sin, guilt, I will restore health. Even the impossible things, not impossible to our God. And the Lord has plans for the ones he loves. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and the people of Judah. The day will come when I will put my law in their minds, write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me. From the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Hear that voice, in the voice that says, I know the plans that I have for you. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. And of course, we believe that those plans are made full in Jesus Christ, and it's already begun. Jeremiah promised a new covenant. What did Jesus come to bring when they passed the cup before he goes to the cross? He says, this is the blood of the new covenant that I give to you. He came to bring that promise into our world. And Jesus looked at that incurable wound because of great sin and guilt, that thing that was beyond healing. And just like Jeremiah says, he says, I will heal it. Isaiah says, by his wounds we are healed. He takes that upon himself. Everlasting love, unfailing kindness. In Jesus, we know that there is a day that will come when all will know the Lord. A day when the struggles of this life will be a distant memory. A day when the Lord who has plans will bring those plans to completion. And on that day, it will be a day of hope. And on that day, that promised future will be the present. That's the promise, the simple promise that we carry with us today. And maybe it's one that speaks to your heart today. I'd invite you to do what the very words of Jeremiah say to do right after that great promise we love. You will find me when you seek after me with all of your heart. Maybe it's time for you to embrace those words today. Maybe you can seek God in the way that you live your life today. Maybe what that means for you today is that, like those in exile, you might need to turn from sin and repent and turn toward him. That's what they were meant to do. Seek him with all their heart. And we do that throughout the entirety of our Christian lives. Constantly, we must turn and keep coming back to him with all of our hearts. Maybe for someone, it's time to do that for the first time, to obey the gospel and be baptized in his name, turn to him, the one who has plans for you, a hope and a future. However you may be called or challenged today, we invite you to respond to this promise while we stand and while we sing.